Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session titled Risky Business, Moral Weights for Animals and Global Priorities with Bob Fischer and Hayley Clatterbuck. I'm Max, the MC for this session. Following the presentation, we'll move on to a live Q&A session where we will respond, or where the speakers will respond to your questions. You can submit questions through the Swap Card Live discussion feature in the bottom right. Then, after 45 minutes, we'll bring the session to an end. Afterwards, there'll be office hours. But first, I'd like to introduce our speakers for this session. Bob is a senior research manager at Rethink Priorities, an associate professor of philosophy at Texas State University, and the director of the Society for the Study of Ethics in Animals. Hayley is a philosophy researcher at Rethink Priorities and an associate professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Without further ado, please welcome Bob Fischer.
Hey, folks, thanks so much for taking your time with us today. We are looking forward to chatting with you about the issues that we've got on the docket for us here. The project is to say a little bit about how to incorporate animals into overall benefit cost analysis so that we can do the project that is the EA project and start deciding what the most cost-effective ways are of doing good, what the best ways are of doing good overall. Part of that involves figuring out how we are going to incorporate animals into our decision-making alongside interventions that affect humans. It's hard enough to assess the interventions affecting animals on their own, but then when we want to compare them to something like the Against Malaria Foundation, we now have to decide how are we going to balance benefits to humans with benefits to animals, and that requires some sort of methodology. And the standard approach, if you take sort of broadly utilitarian assumptions seriously, that often animate a lot of EA thinking about this topic, is that we're going to have to make welfare comparisons. So the idea here, very roughly, is, look, the goal is to do as much good as possible. If we understand the good in terms of improving welfare, of creating positive welfare, then what we are going to have to do is think about, okay, well, how do we make welfare comparisons across species? How do we compare benefits to cattle with benefits to chickens, with benefits to black soldier flies, with benefits to humans? All of those things somehow have to show up on a single scale so that what we can do is say, well, this much good for this many chickens is equal this much good for this many humans. Once we can do that, then we can start doing the thing of saying, okay, well, how much did it cost to produce that good, and look at cost effectiveness overall. So the challenge is to figure out how this might go. And what we're going to do today is just quickly give you a sense of how Rethink Priorities has tried to tackle that question over the course of the last 2 years. That is the Moral Weight Project. And then we're going to try to stand back from that and raise some questions about a background assumption that goes into this kind of cost effectiveness estimate, where what we do is say, okay, let's maximize expected utility as a way of figuring out what we ought to be doing. And so we're going to simultaneously give you this very pro-animal case, and then we're going to pull back just the tiniest bit and say, well, okay, but there may be other values that we want to think about and have on the table as we were having this larger conversation about doing the best good, okay? So that's the big project for today's talk and what we're looking forward to getting through. So here is the background theoretical assumption on the moral weight side. So this is setting aside the decision theory stuff that Hayley's going to talk about in a few minutes. I'm going to talk about the methodology for actually doing the initial welfare comparisons. And the approach that we've got here in the background is to think about welfare as a quantity, as the kind of thing that comes in sums, and that maybe different kinds of organisms can generate different amounts of it. And if that's true, then we can sort of start comparing the size of each animal's bucket of welfare. In other words, in principle, how much welfare could you get from an organism like this? And then you can start saying, okay, well, if you could get that much in principle, how much are you getting in fact? And we could use that as a way of making welfare comparisons. So this approach is theoretically controversial, right? This is not an innocent assumption. There are definitely ways of thinking about this problem where it is inappropriate to think about welfare as being a thing that comes in sums, but part of the broader consequentialist project that we are sort of assuming in the background allows us to frame the question this way, okay? So if you are willing to take that on, then what we can do is go from that bucket analogy and get slightly more precise. And we can say, what we're after is this notion of an organism's capacity for welfare. How much welfare in total is at stake in organisms of that kind? And we can break this into two parts. We can say there's how well or badly things can go for an individual at a time. That's what we're going to call a welfare range. And then how well things can go for that organism over time, right? That's a function of that organism's lifespan. It's what we call a diachronic notion. And that's the whole capacity for welfare. So what we want to do is think about what is the difference in terms of how well can things go at a time, right? The welfare range, and you multiply by lifespan, and that gives you this overall estimate of capacity for welfare. So we're going to focus on that synchronic, the at a time notion of the welfare range. And this is going to help us make welfare comparisons. And what this is now just fleshing out the notion that I gave you before. What this diagram represents here is the welfare range for two kinds of organisms, right? Cattle and chickens. And the idea is, well, suppose that you knew that chickens could only realize half as much welfare, even in principle, right, as cattle. Then what you could do is say, if we can estimate where those animals are relative to how well things could go, if we can do welfare assessments relative to the possible peaks and valleys, bests and worsts for those organisms, then we could do this straightforward conversion, and we could figure out if you've got different numbers of animals and different welfare levels, we can now make direct comparisons. We can complete the project, aggregate, figure out how well off or how much good would you do if you were to help one set of organisms versus the other, right? So all this is just illustrating that idea. But that leaves us with this problem, right? Because now we have this perfectly nice diagram. It's so lovely, right? I spent all of 12 minutes making it in PowerPoint. But that doesn't tell us the crucial question that we want to have an answer to, which is, okay, well, now how are we going to come up with these specific estimates? I just stipulated that maybe a chicken could realize half as much. How are we actually going to do this? Well, one thing that you might hear in the community is people using neuron counts for this purpose. And what they're doing there is they're saying something like this. Well, welfare, it's complicated, seems to have something to do with brains, Welfare is how well things are going from the organism's perspective. The organism's perspective has something to do with its brain. We don't really have a lot of good metrics for comparing the powers of brains. So maybe what we should do is just use a crude metric, sort of like the way economists will use income as a crude metric for well-being in their analyses, and say, well, look, this is the best we can do, right? It's a good starting point. It's a way of getting us in the ballpark, engaging in the project initially, right? So then we could come up with this crucial number back here, right? We came up that 0.5, which is that relationship between the two welfare ranges. We can use the neuron count to give us that ratio, and that's how we're going to come up with the overall estimate, right? And then we're going to get this calculus, right? Now we can do the comparison, again, using that metric. Fine, right? Problem is that it isn't really clear that neuron counts are proxies for anything that matters. They might be proxies for things like intelligence, but we often think that intelligence is not intrinsically morally important, right? You don't matter less than Einstein just because your IQ happens to be lower. Likewise, we might say, well, look, even if neuron counts were proxies for things that really do matter, isn't clear that they're actually going to be the best proxy for that thing. So, right. So maybe suppose that they were a proxy for something that really was important, morally speaking. Well, that wouldn't show that it's the thing that we should care about, right? Because there could still be much better proxies out there, ones that we should use in lieu of that sort of approach. So there's the first question. Are we actually looking at the right sort of proxy? Is this a proxy for a thing that matters? And then even if so, is it going to be the best one? And in both cases, what we want to say is, well, look, there's just a lot of reason to be skeptical. Adam Schreiber has a great report on this. If you look on the forum, you can read all about it. A bunch of details about the reservations we might have about using neuron counts for this purpose. But then if we're going to reject it, we got to do something better. Okay. So here is a general approach, right, from first principles that will get us in the ballpark. And the basic idea is this. Again, we're trying to figure out how to make interspecies welfare comparisons. Cattle versus chickens, humans versus pigs, etc. Okay. Well, what we're going to do then is we're going to say, let's find a theory of welfare, right? There are lots of them: hedonism, desire satisfaction, objectivist, perfectionism, et cetera, right? All these different theories, but we're going to select one. And then we're going to think, well, if that theory were true, desire satisfactionism were true, for instance, what would be proxies, right? What would count as empirical evidence for variation in the ability to realize whatever makes lives go well and badly according to that theory? So if desire satisfaction were true, desire strength would be the thing that's really important. And so we would look for empirical proxies for differences in desire strength. We'd go in and we'd look and say, okay, well, what's the evidence for there being variation? Once we've got the proxies, now you go out, you try to find it, and then you aggregate to come up with an overall picture here of the relative differences between organisms. So this is just a general proposal. Anybody could follow this. Nothing special about the approach. We just think this is the kind of way that you would go from some philosophical theories to an empirical estimate of these differences. Okay. Well, what we did at Rethink Priorities is a version of this that focuses on hedonism. So suppose that hedonism is true. In other words, suppose that welfare comes down to the balance of positively valent states, pleasures, right, versus negatively valent states, pains. And so then what you're going to do is you're going to say, okay, if that's what welfare is, what makes things go well, right? When you get more benefit from a pleasure and you get more of a hit from a pain, well, that's going to be based on the intensity. More intense the pleasure, better it is for you. More intense the pain, the worse it is for you. And so we say, well, what could be proxies for variation in the possible intensities of valence states, right? What could be the case out there? And you're going to survey the literature, and then you're going to, again, aggregate. So look at the evidence and then figure out some method for aggregation. And so these proxies, how we're going to find them, right, is you're going to go and look at evolutionary theories about what valence states are for and think, well, if it's about representing damage or welfare benefits, right? In other words, fitness advantages or fitness disadvantages, and you're going to think about things that might be evidence of variation and the ability to represent that kind of information. So that's the sort of broad process that you're going to use. We did this, right? We identified over 100 proxies, and we did a massive literature search. This involved 18 people over about 18 months. And these were neuroscientists, comparative cognition folks, specialists in particular species, a mix of entomologists and poultry people and so on and so forth, right? Some philosophers. We did this giant inquiry and tried to come up with a big picture about the capacities of these organisms. And as you can see, as from the gray, the most striking thing is how little we know, actually. The animals we farm the most are often the ones we have not studied particularly well, right? They are not of interest for their cognitive and hedonic dimensions. They're of interest for production purposes. So they are surprisingly understudied, despite the fact that we use them in such great numbers. And then we came up with a method for aggregating. Be very careful with this graph. This does not say, a single pig, like, one human equals 2 pigs. That's not what this is doing. This is an attempt to estimate differences in the possible intensities of valent states. So how intense can a pig's pain be relative to a human? This is claiming maybe about half as intense, right? And if you think about it biologically, that should be pretty intuitive. It would be kind of weird if brains as similar as humans in pigs' brains had some feature that it would result in humans having 10,000 times more intense pleasure than pigs, that would be curious, right? That doesn't fit very well with our biological picture. But what's going on here is we now have a way of going from these empirical proxies all the way to estimates of welfare ranges. In other words, how well or badly things can go given a particular theory of welfare for this organism. And then, we came up with these approaches, but I think the important thing to see here is these ranges are pretty wide, a lot of uncertainty, right? We did our best. We think we advanced the conversation. We did something that no one else has tried to do before. However, there's a lot we don't know. And when we recognize our uncertainty, that can help us think, or cause us to think, maybe there's some caution that ought to be incorporated into our analysis to make sure that we don't over-update or act inappropriately based on this work. And that's where Hayley comes in. Go for it. Oh, I think you're muted. Yeah.
Let me unmute. Thank you, Bob. Bob's going to be forwarding my screen, so if there's any sort of awkwardness in the dance, that's why. So I'm going to take up the question of how should we incorporate these numbers that the Moral Weight Project has generated into ethical decision making. So here's a standard way of doing cost effectiveness estimates, and it's to find the action that maximizes expected value. So very briefly, to calculate the expected value of an action, you consider all the possible outcomes of that action. You figure out how much value would accrue in each of those states that could result. You find the probability of those various states resulting, and then you multiply for each state the value that would accrue by the probability of that state obtaining, and then you add them up for all those states. So the results, the expected value, is sort of the weighted average of all the values that could possibly result from your action, and they're weighted by the probability. So when we apply this to the case of animals for whom we are not sure that they are sentient, and for this talk, we'll take sentience to be necessary and sufficient for having moral status. So we can ask, when we talk about something like black soldier flies or shrimp or cockroaches, where we're not sure that this species is even morally considerable at all, how should we take into account our uncertainty about, first of all, whether they have any moral status, and secondly, the kind of uncertainty that Bob raised for how much value they can experience? So here's a common suggestion. So it's been defended recently by Jeff Sebo, Eric Schweizgable, is to say this: the way you should calculate the expected value of an action when it comes to a species, regardless of its sort of questionable moral status, is to do the following. You take the probability that that species is sentient times the value that you would achieve if they are sentient, plus the probability that they're not sentient times the amount of value that would result if they're not sentient. Okay, this is sort of just a straight sort of expected value maximization approach. So on this view, there are three key parameters that we need to input. One is the probability that individuals are sentient. Secondly is the change in value that you would achieve per individual by some intervention. That's going to involve the welfare ranges that Bob was just talking about. And three, the number of individuals that you could affect with your action. Interestingly, it seems that when you adopt expected value maximization, you get a certain kind of robust result. And that's what Jeff Sebo calls the repugnant conclusion. Here's how it's supposed to come about. It's an interesting fact about our world that there's a negative correlation between numerosity of a species and the probability that that species is sentient. Animals with low probabilities of sentient are far more numerous than animals with high probabilities. This holds for both wild animals. So for example, there are 1.4 billion insects for each person. And that negative correlation also holds among farmed animals. So if you see 300 million cows are estimated to be killed each year, we're pretty sure that they're sentient, but over 1 trillion insects are farmed each year. So what's the result of this difference? Well, if you calculate the expected value of an action to, say, help shrimp versus humans, here's how the math kind of works out. So I asked some of the team to give me some plausible but not totally accurate numbers here. Imagine an action to help shrimp that affects 100 million individuals. So for example, we might institute practices to stun before slaughter or to reduce ammonia concentrations, something like that. We assume that shrimp have a baseline value of negative 0.01 units of value per shrimp. And the action that we do increases that average value of their lives to 0. So they have we're assuming a very narrow welfare range. We're also assuming a fairly low probability of shrimp sentience for this example. So suppose there's only a 10% chance that shrimp are sentient. The expected value of helping shrimp, well, I'll talk about humans second. A similar amount of money that could be used to help humans might affect 1,000 humans, say by buying malaria nets. We assume that the baseline value of those humans you could help is 10. And the action increases that value to 50. So for example, you save 1,000 children that would have died, and you extend their average life to 50 years. And we assume a probability that humans are sentient of 1. On the right, I've calculated the expected value of these actions. And you can see that the expected value of helping shrimp is quite a bit higher than the expected value of helping humans. And the reason is that the ratio between our sentience ranges and our welfare ranges, while considerable, is very small compared to the ratio between the number of individuals that could be helped. So this is, again, the repugnant conclusion. Even if the probabilities of sentience and welfare ranges for this many small invertebrates are low, their sheer numbers will overcome this difference. So expected value maximization suggests that we should almost always prioritize numerous animals of uncertain sentience over large animals of more probable sentience. So it's going to give the result that we should target almost all of our animal welfare actions towards insects, shrimp, things like that, as opposed to humans, cows, things like that. So a lot of people find this result unintuitive at the worst and like maybe morally like pernicious at the even worst. And so we want to look at various ways of replying to the repugnant conclusion. What are various ways you might try to reject its conclusions? One approach that we see quite often is what we call hierarchicalism. So one thing you could do is you could say, look, we're going to try to maximize expected value, but what we're going to do is give a boost to the value we assign to human experiences and downgrade the value that we assign to, say, shrimp experiences. So a hierarchicalist gives extra weight to the well-being or hedonic experience of some species over others. So the result, if you sort of like add a multiplier where every human dolly is worth 10 times as much as every shrimp dolly, for example, you can get actions to help humans have higher expected value. We have a few problems with this. One is that if you're kind of roughly a welfare consequentialist, if you're roughly like think hedonism might be true, this just looks speciesist, right? It's just saying that like a given unit of suffering matters more when it matters to a human than a shrimp, even if it has the same kind of valence and the same kind of intensity. That seems to be sort of making a moral difference without any grounding in the actual subjective experience of those creatures. Secondly, even if you do think that you should weight human suffering more strongly than other animals, what number would you choose? Our expected values are going to depend on that choice of number, and we don't see a way of saying that human pain matters 10 times more rather than 1,000 times more rather than 1,000,000 times more than shrimp. So we wanted to find another approach to rebutting the repugnant conclusion. So we thought it might be a promising lead to look at approaches to calculating the value of actions that incorporate risk aversion. So expected value maximization is a risk-neutral decision theory, but actual decision makers are often risk averse. To sort of motivate this, look at the following bets. Each of these bets has the exact same expected value. However, if you sort of react differently to them or you think that you prefer one over the other, it's probably because you are risk averse in some way. So for example, a sure thing of 4.5, I offer you $4.50 or something, has the same expected value as I flip a coin, I give you 10 if it's heads, I take 1 from you if it's tails, or I give you 1,000,000 if it's heads and take 999,000 if it's tails, or I offer you a bet that has a 1 in a million chance of 5.5 million or cost you $1 otherwise. Again, these can be measured in terms of expected value where they're all the same, but some of these bets yield a very high probability that you'll lose a lot of money, and some of them yield a very tiny chance you're going to win anything at all. So if you think these bets are different, it's because probably you're sensitive to some sort of risk aversion. So risk aversion can explain cases in which expected value maximization seems to get the wrong result. And so if risk aversion is rational, maybe this provides us a rational reason from departing from the kind of procedure that led to the repugnant conclusion. So we asked, does risk aversion explain our resistance to, or explain why it would be rational to reject this conclusion? And the answer is complicated. It depends on what you mean by risk aversion. So we're going to walk through 3 different kinds of risk attitudes and show the results that they have for the repugnant conclusion. I'm going to go pretty quickly through them. I'm not going to introduce the formal models that we use. We've published something on the forum in the last month that does unpack all of these. So if you want the details, you can go look at that. Here's a reason you might be risk averse. Maybe you care about avoiding the worst outcomes, right? So you're really worried about losing that $1 million. And so you put extra weight on avoiding the worst outcomes, and you're less swayed by the possible good things that could happen. So there are models of avoid the worst risk aversion that says if you're really worried about not ending up in the worst case scenario, how would you act? So when it comes to animals of dubious moral status, there are 2 relevant scenarios. Either shrimp are sentient and suffering in enormous numbers, or shrimp are not sentient and the money that we could spend on them we could use to save some smaller amount of human lives. And you can ask yourself, which of these is the worst case scenario? And it seems like it's the first one, right? The worst case scenario, if you're really risk averse, is like, I don't think shrimp are probably sentient, but if they are, that's really bad. So I should assume the worst and act according to that. If you model that with the decision theory, as you see on the left, risk-adjusted expected value, you see that incorporating risk in this sense makes the action to help humans look even worse compared to shrimp. And that makes sense. Because if you really are worried about the worst case scenario, it's a horrendous thing we're doing to shrimp every day, you should be even more inclined to help shrimp, even if you think there's a low chance of it mattering. So that's not going to help us rebut the repugnant conclusion. Maybe it's right. So we wanted to look around, is there any other kind of risk aversion that could give us the opposite result? Here's another kind of risk attitude you might have. So imagine a case. Jane is a big philanthropic donor, and she's been giving millions of dollars to combat human childhood malnutrition. She's considering redirecting all that money towards improving conditions at insect farms, even though she thinks that insects only have a 1% chance of being sentient. You might reasonably reply, that's really risky. You're saying there's a 99% chance that you're throwing away your money, right? Helping things that don't have any subjective experience whatsoever. On the other hand, the sure thing bet is to help creatures like us who you know are sentient and have experiences. So that seems like a really risky thing you did. So we can ask, what if this appeals to you, what are you averse to? What kind of risk? And this is risk aversion about making a difference, okay? You're risk averse about efficacy. You're concerned with trying to make things better or not worse. So you want to avoid states where your philanthropic actions have no effect or they make things worse. We've come up with a decision theory like this as well that you can see the details of. But if you measure actions by how much good they do, how much of a difference they make, and you're really concerned with avoiding doing nothing, then it turns out that we get a decision theory that favors helping humans over shrimp. Because with shrimp, you have a small chance of making a big difference. With humans, you have a large chance of making a smaller difference. And if you're sensitive to the chances of making a difference, you're going to put your bets on the more sure thing of helping humans. A difference-making risk-averse agent we think is interesting because they're going to strongly resemble the sort of hierarchicalist. But we think it doesn't make as much as many questionable or morally objectionable assumptions. So you are going to sort of rank animals by their probability of sentience. And you're going to be more inclined to help the animals that have higher probabilities of sentience. But you're going to do it for a different reason. It's not because you think they matter more if they are sentient. It's just that they have a higher probability of mattering. Okay, so it's not like I think shrimp are worthless, I don't care about their suffering. You're saying if they're suffering, that is a big deal, but I want my dollars to go somewhere and do good in the world, and I think they have a lower chance of mattering. We also think this is more defensible just because you're going to be more sensitive to new information about the probability of sentience. If you find more information that shrimp are sentient that bumps you up to 0.5, that's going to matter to you. And we think it might not matter to a hierarchicalist. Lastly, there's a third kind of risk aversion that's not captured by the cases that I presented earlier, but I think it's intuitive. Economists have long noted that lots of people are ambiguity averse. And here's what that means. You avoid making bets where you're unsure about the probabilities. Okay, so for example, if I say, hey, I'm going to flip a coin, and if it's heads, I'll give you $1,000. If it's tails, I'll give you $0. But you have no idea what the probability of heads is. It could be a fair coin. It could be totally biased towards tails or totally biased towards heads. A lot of people are averse to taking bets like that. People prefer to take bets where they know what the chances are, even if by their lights, the more uncertain sort of bets would have a higher expected value. So this is a robust kind of risk aversion. And it applies to the case here. Remember what Bob showed in the charts he was showing. There are just a lot of unknowns about the sentience and welfare ranges of some species, particularly those that are heavily farmed, and particularly those that are quite numerous. So our probabilities of sentience for the many small, like black soldier flies, are not just lower, they're also highly uncertain. So reporting my own sort of subjective credences, I'm willing to entertain a narrow range of probabilities of sentience for chickens, right? I'm willing to entertain sort of like, maybe there's a 75% chance or a 99% chance, somewhere in there for chickens. But I'm willing to entertain a much wider range of degrees or probabilities of sentience for shrimp, right? Depending on sort of what information you give me, I might think like, yeah, I would accept that they have a 10% chance of being sentient all the way to 75%. I'm just a lot less certain about the probability to assign. Given this correlation, the many numerous are also highly ambiguous. This is going to give someone who's ambiguity averse a reason to avoid taking bets on the many small. Why are the many small, like, why are we more uncertain about them? As Bob noted, we've studied them less. And secondly, they're harder to study. So here are sort of 4 decision theories. Risk neutral EVM, avoid the worst case scenario, avoid making no difference or making things worse, and ambiguity aversion. And here's sort of the results that they yield. Very quickly, I'll just mention, we looked at chickens as well. So humans and shrimp, we compared something that's very certainly sentient and less numerous versus shrimp, which is low probability of sentience and very numerous. Chickens are both quite probably sentient and very numerous at the same time. So we sort of ran these numbers of the decision theories we looked at. You can go ahead, Bob. And here's what resulted. On each of the decision theories we looked at, expected value, risk-adjusted expected value, and difference-making risk-adjusted expected value, chickens outperformed all other actions. So chickens are sort of nice by the lights of risk aversion because you have a high probability of success and you'll yield a lot of value if you are successful. Okay, so here's sort of the conclusion, stepping back. I've been going a little fast, so we have time for Q&A. When individuals of uncertain moral status vastly outnumber individuals of certain moral status, typical cost-effective methods will favor them. Maybe that's right, but given that strikes people as a lot of people as unintuitive, we wanted to explore various alternative decision theories and see what they would say about sort of which animal species we ought to privilege over others in our giving. We considered an axiological solution that says, look, given these results, we should just assign less value to the lives of insects and other invertebrates and other sort of numerous animals. We think that's wrongheaded. We think that we should sort of like straightforwardly encounter species as they are, and we should take seriously that every species' subjective experiences matter. The other way of sort of responding to this is to say, look, what's generating these doubts in us is not the value of these species, but the probability that they have moral status at all. So the solution should be something that is responsive to this low probability, okay? And risk-averse decision theories are precisely sort of the kind of theories that say the probability of success matters, and gives you ways of incorporating risk aversion about low probabilities. So given that risk attitudes embody ways of sort of getting what's valuable given their probabilities, we think these are kind of promising avenues to go down to say, if you have some risk aversion, how should you think about your giving in the animal sphere? And these are sort of some tentative solutions that we've come up with. Thank you for that, and we will go to Q&A.
Thank you, speakers. So for our first question, how different are the cost effectiveness estimates of interventions helping animals under these different proxies for moral weights, e.g. neuron count versus the presented welfare range, assuming hedonism?
So it depends on whether you're thinking about the risk aversion component or whether you're just focusing on something like the difference between neuron counts and rethink priorities welfare range estimates. But very roughly, we're something like an order of magnitude or two higher than the neuron count estimates are going to be. So animals are in general going to look a lot better relative to at least near-termist human affecting interventions. But of course, then once you incorporate risk aversion, some things are going to shift around where, as Hayley was saying at the end there, chickens suddenly look really great. And shrimp would have dominated them previously, but then they are not going to once we've factored in a concern, say, for difference making.
Makes sense. Yeah. So what research do either of you think is missing to increase certainty about X having capacity for hedonic experiences? So they give, e.g., matter, such as like stones or atoms or plants, but I think you could take it more generally as well.
Sure. So I'll say a quick thing about this, and maybe Hayley has other views. To some degree, there's just a ton of empirical work that needs to be done. I mean, there's not that much more that can be done from the armchair looking at the secondary literature at this point, because it's really that we just don't know very much about many of the capacities that are potentially evidence of sentience. So, for instance, there are all, look at Jonathan Birch's lab. This is, if you really want to learn about this, go look at Jonathan Birch's lab, look at the kinds of things that they are currently trying to study in crickets, and you'll get some sense of what the sort of the next phase of consciousness research looks like. It's almost all empirical at this point.
I should also just mention the recent report that came out with a whole bunch of collaborators, but headed up by Robert Long, trying to apply some of these things to current large language models and other AIs. And so I think that's another frontier too. So I think, as when we talk about small invertebrates, I think there are two challenges. The primary one, as Bob mentioned, is just willingness to do the empirical work. And the second thing is that it gets harder to study the consciousness in a species the further they are from us, right? We're just like less sure how sentience would manifest. And some of those challenges are even worse when you get to AIs. So I take it that's going to be another one of these kind of frontiers in consciousness research, where it's less clear that it's just empirical considerations getting in the way, but there's sort of more theoretical work to be done about what would a marker of sentience even look like.
Great, that makes sense. Yeah. So how have your findings here affected the way either of you go about like practically in the world? So if you donated to like animal welfare organizations, like how has this changed maybe your donations?
Yeah, well, I personally spend almost half my time now working on insects. So I think the Moral Weight Project for me was a very significant update in favor of those organisms. In my own case, I've come to think that the probability of sentience for at least some significant class of farmed insects is sort of close to a coin flip. So there, if your probabilities get that high, then the difference making risk aversion sorts of concerns that Haley's discussing are, they bite less acutely. So I'm not in a situation where I think like, well, yeah, point one on crickets being sentient or point one on black soldier flies. So for me, significant update in favor of invertebrates generally and insects in particular. And so I'm willing to spend a lot of time on that professionally. But I think the work that Haley did around risk aversion has certainly, given me pause and made me ask, okay, I really do think I should be looking seriously at chickens as an important cause area. And of course, that's been something I've cared about for a long time, but have not been working on in a personal capacity.
Yeah, I think just personally, doing a bit of an exploration of this has sort of made me reflect on what my risk attitudes are and which ones are rational or proper to have here, right? So I think I've given more to the sort of avoid the worst risk aversion than I think I had thought about before, right? So if you think about I think in most everyday cases, I'm pretty avoid the worst risk averse. Like I get to the airport early, I do those kinds of things because I'm very swayed by the worst thing that could happen. And so I think part of this project was to give a little bit more credence to that as a decision theory and to think, wow, the worst case scenario when it comes to like when you really appreciate the numbers of shrimp and insects that we're killing every year, that combination of both seeing the numbers and giving more sort of weight to a decision theory that makes me think I should really care about that the small possibility we're doing something really abhorrent. I'm not sure it's shifted my behavior, but it's made me a little bit more reflective of sort of other reasons in the space and maybe a little bit more empathy for people in the space who are extremely motivated by the worst case scenario to say like, yeah, actually that seems legitimate in a lot of cases.
Makes sense. Yeah. Okay, so this is a question about how to think about the threshold effects of neuron counts or critical neuroanatomy. Which could make it reasonable for human brains to have many orders of magnitude more capacity for pleasure or pain than, for example, a pig. So I guess they're wondering how either of you kind of think about that.
So I take it the question is something like, look, maybe it just turns out that once certain capacities come online, which are anchored in certain numbers of neurons or numbers of connections between neurons or, whatever the case may be, certain functional abilities, then you're going to get some significant difference in the level of the intensity of the suffering that's possible. So maybe it jumps up, orders of magnitude once you've crossed some particular functional capacity threshold. I think the right thing to say about that is, yeah, totally could work that way. What's the evidence? Like it's not that we got some decisive reason to think things do not work that way. It's the total absence of biological evidence for that kind of effect. I think what often happens, my own view, is that this is a case where people are not really thinking carefully about the theory of welfare. So I think what's going on is people are saying, I have this very strong intuition that humans matter way more than animals. I hear you that you've done this all in terms of hedonism, and so it's supposed to all be about intensities of pleasures and pains. But so now I'm sort of like committed to finding a difference in terms of intensities of pleasures and pains to have this conversation with you. But really what's going on is that I think they have got some other views that are lurking in the background. They just think like, oh, we have different kinds of desires, or maybe it matters that we're knowers, or that we can do certain kinds of sophisticated planning, or whatever the case may be. Because it's very hard to explain why human brains would suddenly acquire, why they would have any adaptive value to acquire pains that are that much more intense than anything that a pig experiences, when really it seems like most of the things that make humans so impressive are the kind of social learning we have, and facts about the amount of information that we can retain and the way we can encode it and express it, which has nothing to do necessarily with the intensity of the valence states that we've got.
Great. So how do you think about like incorporating moral uncertainty into your decision making with this, or like any approach you have? So if you have like credences and theories that don't say much about how to like quantify welfare, such as deontology.
That's tough. One thing I should say is, I mean, that's something that our team is really well aware of as a pressing problem, and sort of something for future work. One sort of like intermediate step to get all the way there is to say, just taking the work I presented, I've given you 3 sort of risk attitudes that you can have, and those have been formalized into, decision theories that you can use. And they give very different results. And so the reasonable next question is, what kind of risk aversion, if any, should I possess when I think here, right? Like, should I care about the overall state of the world and really worry about the worst case scenario? Should I care about how much difference my money can make? That's going to make a huge difference here. And I haven't told you which, if any, of those risk attitudes are appropriate for particular circumstances, if any of them are. And certainly a large proportion of our audience is probably going to reject all sort of risk-weighted decision theories. Expected value maximization has a lot to be said for it. So in a sort of small case, right, a next question is just, these are different kinds of attitudes about how to achieve the things that we think are valuable. Which of them should we choose and why? And if you're uncertain about whether you should be risky in a certain way, how should you incorporate uncertainty over that? I don't have anything like pithy to say, except that that's really difficult. In your risk aversion is probably going to percolate up to the way you deal with moral uncertainty. Yes. It's tough. It's there. It's important. And I think it's the next question to ask. And Bob, I don't know if you have any other thoughts.
Just one quick thing to add on that is to say that, what we have tried to do is work within a welfare consequentialist framework that is common within EA, and then just not necessarily go in for the expected value maximization component. So let's keep the sort of moral theory in place and then just modify the way you then respond to the moral facts as we are understanding them. However, there are folks who want to give up that very first step and think about resource allocation in a completely different sort of way. That project is just long and complicated, and there are you just need to go read the folks who are trying to do it. So one really great place to start would be looking at Theron Pummer's work, who has been trying to develop for the last several years a non-consequentialist approach to effective altruism. And so that's the kind of stuff you want to be reading if that's what you're interested in.
Great. So I think this is like kind of related to what you were just saying, but like, do either of you know of like good estimates of the moral weight of animals that exist elsewhere, or like how they compare to like the sort of work Rethink Priorities has been doing?
Yeah, so basically there's nothing out there that is attempting to do a principled approach to this other than people using neuron counts. And look, neuron counts are still not that unfavorable to animals compared to just, surveying the general public. If you survey the general public, they'll say, or at least some number of people will say, there is no number of chickens for which you should ever sacrifice a human interest. So, even using something like that is going to give you fairly pro-animal results. We ourselves have, got a survey that we're working on where we're trying to figure out how to validate, or at least to some degree, confirm the sorts of results that we got. This is a very difficult issue. these are big projects. They take lots of people and time. So, without additional resources, it's difficult to put anything like this together. And so you're not going to find lots of independent estimates, right? This really is sort of blue sky research.
Well, thank you to both of our speakers. This is unfortunately all the time we have, but if you still have questions, feel free to head over to the office hours immediately following this. And thank you again.
Thank you both.
Thank you.